The year is 1872. The Arizona Territory stretches vast and unforgiving beneath a merciless sun. Dust devils dance across the desert floor, and the only sounds are the whisper of wind through mesquite and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. This is the story of James McKenna, a rancher who changed history with a single act of kindness and nearly paid for it with his life. We see a modest ranch carved out of the harsh landscape. A wooden fence surrounds a small homestead, a single-story adobe house, a barn, and a well. Cattle graze on sparse vegetation. Everything speaks of hard work and harder living. In the spring of 1872, James McKenna was just trying to survive. A former Union soldier turned rancher. He'd claimed a piece of land in the Arizona Territory that nobody else wanted. Too dry, too dangerous, too close to Apache country. But James was stubborn. He'd built his dream with his own two hands, and he wasn't going to let anyone or anything drive him away. James McKenna, a weathered man in his mid-30s with sun-darkened skin and kind eyes, stands at his window, drinking coffee from a tin cup. He's watching the sunrise paint the desert gold and crimson. The peace is shattered by the sound of his dog barking frantically. James, muttering, "What now, Duke?" He sets down his coffee and grabs his rifle, not out of aggression, but necessity. In Apache territory, a man who doesn't carry a gun doesn't last long. James steps outside, squinting into the early morning light. Duke, a mangy cattle dog, is barking at something near the well. James approaches cautiously, rifle at the ready. What he sees stops him in his tracks. Two Apache women stand by his well. But these aren't ordinary women. Both tower over 6 feet tall, massive, muscular figures that command immediate respect. Their traditional Apache clothing is travel-worn and dusty. Their faces are gaunt with hunger, but their eyes burn with fierce pride. The taller of the two, who James will later learn is called Nalin, meaning maiden, stands protectively in front of her sister, Kasa, meaning clothed in furs. Despite their obvious exhaustion, their posture radiates defiance. James had heard the stories. Apache women were known to be as fierce as the men, skilled riders, expert trackers, and deadly fighters when necessary. But he'd never seen women quite like these. They looked like warrior goddesses from an ancient legend, and they looked like they hadn't eaten in days. James slowly lowers his rifle, raising one hand in a gesture of peace. James, carefully, I mean no harm. Nalin's hand rests on the knife at her belt. She doesn't move, doesn't speak. Her dark eyes assess him, calculating threats, measuring distance to escape routes. Kasa sways slightly behind her, clearly weakened. James notices a pool of water at their feet. They'd been drinking from his well. He sees Kasa's trembling hands, the way Nalin's jaw is set against her own obvious hunger. He makes a decision that will change everything. James, slowly setting down his rifle, wait here. Please. He holds up both hands again, then turns and walks back toward his house. Behind him, he hears Nalin say something sharp in Apache to her sister. He doesn't look back, trusting that they won't shoot him in the back, and praying his trust isn't misplaced. James moves quickly, gathering food. Bread, dried meat, cheese, a jar of preserves, apples from his root cellar. He throws it all into a cloth sack, adding a canteen of fresh water. His hands shake slightly as he works. He knows what he's doing could be seen as collaboration with the enemy. Many of his neighbors have lost family to Apache raids. But he also knows what he saw in those women's eyes, not malice, but desperation. James returns to find the sisters exactly where he left them. He approaches slowly, holding out the sack of food. James, take it, please. Nalin doesn't move at first. The tension stretches out like a bowstring pulled taut. Then, slowly, she reaches out and takes the sack. Her fingers brush James's for just a moment, and he sees something flicker in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or confusion. She opens the sack, looks inside, then exchanges a long look with her sister. Kasa's eyes widen at the sight of the food. Nalin, in heavily accented English, why? It's the first word she's spoken, and it carries the weight of 1,000 questions. Why help us? Why risk it? Why show kindness to your enemies? James, simply, because you're hungry. It was that simple, and that complicated. In a land where violence begot violence, where revenge was a currency more common than gold, James McKenna chose kindness. He didn't know their names. He didn't know their story, that they were daughters of a powerful chief, that they'd been separated from their people during a cavalry pursuit, that they'd been wandering for 3 days without food or water. All he knew was that they were human beings and they needed help. Nalin studies James for a long moment, then nods once, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. She hands the canteen to Kasa, who drinks deeply. Then they begin to eat, standing there by the well, never taking their eyes off James. He doesn't press them to talk. He doesn't ask questions. He simply stands there, a witness to their desperate hunger, until they've eaten their fill. When they're finished, Nalin carefully folds the cloth sack and hands it back to James. She says something in Apache, a short phrase that sounds formal, ritualistic. Then she touches her hand to her heart. Nalin, we remember. The sisters turn and walk away, heading east toward the mountains. James watches them go, the tall figures growing smaller against the vast landscape, until they disappear into the heat shimmer. He picks up his rifle and returns to his house, thinking that's the end of it. A strange encounter, a good deed done, a story to tell someday. He has no idea that the real story is just beginning. We see James going about his daily routine, mending fences, tending cattle, drawing water, chopping wood. The sun arcs across the sky. Evening falls. He eats a simple dinner alone, cleans his rifle, checks the locks on his barn. As darkness settles over the desert, James lights a lamp and sits at his table, writing a letter to his sister back east. Outside, coyotes yip in the distance. The night is cool and clear, the stars brilliant overhead. James eventually blows out his lamp and goes to bed, the events of the morning already fading in his mind. He sleeps peacefully, having no idea what dawn will bring. The sun rises over the desert, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Birds begin their morning chorus. Duke starts to stir in the barn. And then, as the light grows stronger, a sight emerges from the dawn shadows that would make any man's blood run cold. In complete silence. Warriors, mounted Apache warriors on painted horses, arranged in concentric circles around James's property. Their faces are painted for war. They carry rifles, bows, lances. Morning light glints off knife blades and metal ammunition. At the front, mounted on a magnificent bay horse, sits a man who can only be a great chief. He wears a war bonnet of eagle feathers and a breastplate of bone and trade beads. His face is weathered like ancient stone, and his eyes hold the weight of countless battles. Beside him sit Nalin and Kasa, the 2 giant sisters from the day before. James wakes to Duke's frantic barking. He stumbles out of bed, pulling on his pants, and goes to the window. What he sees freezes him in place. His ranch is surrounded, completely surrounded. He does a quick count, 200 warriors at least, maybe more. Some are still emerging from the desert, materializing like ghosts from behind rocks and mesquite. James, whispering, Mother of God. Later, James would say that his life didn't flash before his eyes. Instead, he found himself thinking about his sister's children back in Pennsylvania. 2 little girls he'd never see grow up. He thought about the letter he'd written last night, sitting on his table, that would never be sent. He thought, with strange clarity, that at least he'd die on land he'd built with his own hands. James steps outside unarmed. There's no point in bringing a rifle. 1 gun against 200 is no gun at all. If these warriors wanted him dead, he'd be dead already. He walks slowly toward the mounted chief, his heart hammering but his steps steady. Duke follows, growling low, but James commands him to stay. The warriors watch in complete silence. Not one of them moves. The only sounds are the jingle of horse tack and the whisper of wind. James stops about 20 feet from the chief, close enough to speak, but far enough to be respectful. He meets the old man's eyes directly, not challenging, but not cowering either. For a long moment, nobody speaks. James learned later that he was looking at Chief Cochise himself, one of the most feared Apache leaders in the entire Southwest. Cochise had been fighting the U.S. Army for over a decade, had eluded capture countless times, had led raids that became legend. He was a man who'd seen his people killed, his land stolen, his way of life destroyed. And James McKenna stood before him, a single rancher with nothing but the clothes on his back. Cochise finally speaks, a long statement in Apache, his voice deep and commanding. James doesn't understand a word, but he listens intently, watching the chief's face. When Cochise finishes, Nalin translates, her voice carrying across the silent morning. Nalin, my father, Chief Cochise, asks why you fed his daughters when you could have killed them, when you could have claimed a bounty for their scalps, when you could have sold them to the soldiers. James, his voice steadier than he feels, tell your father that I fed them because they were hungry. No other reason. Where I come from, you don't let people starve, even if they're strangers. Especially if they're strangers. Nalin translates. Cochise listens, his face unreadable. Then he speaks again, shorter this time. Nalin, my father says you are either very brave or very foolish. James, allowing himself a small smile. Probably both, ma'am. A ripple of surprise runs through the nearest warriors at this response. Even Nalin's lips quirk slightly. She translates, and for the first time, something that might be amusement crosses Cochise's face. The chief speaks again, longer this time, with more force. Nalin translates, and James can hear emotion in her voice now. Nalin, my father, says he has fought the white men for many years. They have killed his brothers, his cousins, his friends. They have poisoned water holes. They have slaughtered women and children. They have burned villages. They have driven us from our ancestral lands. He has seen so much death that he thought all white men were the same, greedy, violent, without honor. She pauses, and when she continues, her voice is softer. Nalin, yesterday, my sister and I thought we would die. We had been running from the cavalry for 3 days. We had no food, little water. When we saw your ranch, we expected to find either death or capture. Instead, we found kindness. My father says this has made him think. One act of kindness cannot erase years of war, but it can remind him that not all men are monsters. James felt tears prick his eyes, though he blinked them back. He thought of all the stories he'd heard, of Apache brutality, of savage raiders, of merciless warriors, and now he stood surrounded by hundreds of these savages. And what he heard was a father's gratitude that his daughters hadn't died alone in the desert. Cochise speaks again, and this time his tone is formal, ritualistic. Around him, the warriors sit straighter in their saddles. Nalin, my father makes you this promise. As long as you remain on this land, no Apache warrior will harm you or your property. You will be under our protection. Any man who breaks this promise will answer to Cochise himself. She pauses, then adds something that sounds personal rather than translated. Nalin, you saved our lives, James McKenna. We do not forget debts. Before James can respond, Cochise raises his hand. As one, the warriors begin to move, wheeling their horses around and riding away. The movement is coordinated, almost choreographed, a display of discipline and unity. Nalin and Kasa linger for a moment longer. Nalin reaches into a pouch at her side and removes something, a necklace of turquoise and silver, beautiful and clearly valuable. She leans down from her horse and hands it to James. Nalin, wear this. All Apache will know you are under Cochise's protection. James, accepting the necklace with trembling hands, I thank you. Thank your father. Tell him. He pauses, searching for the right words. James, tell him I hope someday there can be peace. Real peace. Between all our peoples. Nalin, softly. Perhaps there can be, James McKenna. Perhaps there can be. James watches as the last warriors disappear into the desert, the dust from their horses' hooves hanging in the air like golden mist. He stands there for a long time, the turquoise necklace heavy in his hands, trying to process what just happened. Duke comes and sits beside him, no longer growling, somehow sensing that the danger has passed. James to Duke, well, boy, I think we just made some very unusual friends. We see James continuing his work at the ranch, but now with an awareness of watchers. Sometimes he catches glimpses of Apache scouts on distant ridges. Once, he finds a deer carcass left by his gate, fresh meat, more than he can eat himself. Another time, he discovers his broken fence has been repaired overnight. He begins wearing the turquoise necklace every day. Word spreads among other ranchers about James's protection. Some think he's a traitor. Others think he's a fool. But none of them can deny one fact. While other ranches are raided, while other settlers lose cattle and horses, James McKenna's property remains untouched. Over the following months, James became an unofficial intermediary between the Apache and the settlers. When tensions rose, both sides knew they could send word to McKenna, and he would help negotiate. He never took sides. He simply reminded both groups that there was another way besides violence. It didn't always work. There were still raids, still battles, still deaths. But in that corner of Arizona territory, around James McKenna's ranch, a fragile peace held. James is repairing his barn roof when he sees riders approaching. Not Apache this time, U.S. cavalry. A lieutenant and 4 soldiers. He climbs down from the roof, wiping his hands on his pants, and waits. Lieutenant Harris, dismounting, Mr. McKenna? Lieutenant Harris, 3rd Cavalry. Mind if we talk? James free country. Supposedly. The lieutenant notices the turquoise necklace, and his expression hardens. Lieutenant Harris, I see you're wearing Apache jewelry. James, a gift. Lieutenant Harris, from Cochise's people? James, that's right. Lieutenant Harris, choosing his words carefully. Mr. McKenna, we've received reports that you have relationships with hostile Apache tribes. Some people say you're helping them, giving them information about troop movements, sheltering scouts. James, evenly. Some people say a lot of things, Lieutenant. Most of them aren't true. Lieutenant Harris, so you deny having contact with Cochise? James the First didn't say that. I said I'm not helping them attack anyone. There's a difference. The lieutenant studies him for a long moment. Lieutenant Harris, what happened here, Mr. McKenna? Why does Cochise protect your ranch? James, shrugging. I fed 2 hungry women. Turned out they were important. Lieutenant Harris, that's it? You gave them food, and now you're under the protection of the most dangerous Apache war chief in the territory? James, meeting his eyes. Sometimes kindness goes further than guns, Lieutenant. You might want to remember that. Lieutenant Harris left that day without arresting James, but the visit was a reminder of how precarious the situation was. James was walking a tightrope between 2 worlds, trusted by neither, but needed by both. That evening, as James sits on his porch watching the sunset, a single Apache rider approaches. James recognizes her immediately, Nalin, even taller and more imposing on horseback. She dismounts and approaches the porch. James stands. Nalin, my father sent me. The cavalry was here today. James, not surprised she knows they were. Nalin, what did you tell them? James, the truth. That I fed 2 hungry women, and their father was grateful. Nalin nods slowly, studying his face. Nalin, the truth is a rare thing in these times, James McKenna. Most men on both sides deal only in lies and hatred. James, sitting back down. I'm just trying to live my life, ma'am. And maybe, if I'm lucky, help a few people along the way. Nalin, after a pause, my father says to tell you this. The old ways are ending. More soldiers come every year. More settlers. He knows he cannot fight forever. But before the end comes, he wants you to know that you gave him something precious. You reminded him that honor still exists in this world. James feels a lump in his throat. He nods, not trusting himself to speak. Nalin, continuing, and I tell you this from me, not from my father. You saved my life and my sister's life. In Apache tradition, this creates a bond that can never be broken. If you ever need help, truly need it, send word. We will come. James, finding his voice, thank you, Nalin, for everything. She nods once more, remounts her horse, and rides away into the gathering darkness. True to Cochise's word, James McKenna's ranch remained under Apache protection for the next 2 years, until Cochise finally made peace with the U.S. government in 1874. Even after that, even as Cochise's people were moved to reservations, the old chief sent word to his warriors. James McKenna was to be left in peace. Cochise died in 1874, but the protection held. Nalin and Kasa, now legendary figures in their own right, made sure their father's promise was kept. For the rest of James's life, no Apache ever raised a hand against him. An older James McKenna, now in his 60s with gray hair and a lined face, sits on his porch, The ranch has expanded over the years. More buildings, better fences, a real house instead of a shack. Around his neck, he still wears the turquoise necklace. A young couple approaches, settlers new to the territory. The husband is nervous, keeping one hand on his holstered gun. "Young settler Mr. McKenna, we heard you know something about dealing with Indians. We've got a claim about 10 miles east, and we're worried." James, gesturing for them to sit. "Worried about raids?" "Young wife, everyone says the Apache are dangerous, that they'll kill us in our sleep." James looks at them both, these young people so full of fear and ignorance, and he sees his younger self, scared alone, making a home in a hostile land. "James, let me tell you a story. It starts with 2 hungry women and a sack of food." We return to that dawn morning, seeing James hand a sack of food to Nalin and Kasa. But this time we also see Apache scouts watching from the hills, reporting back to Cochise. We see the chief's council that night, debating what to do about this unusual white rancher. We see Cochise making his decision, mounting his warriors, riding to McKenna's ranch not for revenge but for recognition. James McKenna's story became legendary in the Arizona Territory. Some called it luck. Others called it divine providence. But those who knew the truth understood it was something simpler and more profound. It was the power of a single act of kindness in a world consumed by hatred. James never claimed to be a hero. He never asked for recognition. He simply lived his life according to his principles, treating all people, red, white, or any other color, with basic human decency. And in doing so, he proved that one man could make a difference, that kindness could triumph over fear, that peace, however fragile, was always possible if people were willing to see the humanity in each other. The older James finishes his story. The young couple sits in stunned silence. "Young wife, so what happened to the sisters?" To Nalin and Kasa. James, smiling. "They became leaders in their community on the reservation, fought for their people's rights, their children's education. Nalin learned to write, started sending letters to congressmen and newspapers, demanding better treatment. Kasa became a healer, blending traditional Apache medicine with what she learned from army doctors. They never forgot where they came 30 from. Years after they never let hatred consume them. They still remember. Young settler looks out at the desert. They still remember painted gold, James, red by the touching his necklace. They sent me this new string of turquoise. You asked me how to deal with the Apache. Here's my advice. Remember that they're people. Just people trying to survive, trying to protect their families, trying to hold on to their way of life. Treat them with respect, and most times, they'll treat you the same way. Not always. People are complicated, and history is messy. But most times. Young wife, it can't be that simple. James, shrugging, maybe not, but it's a good place to start. The young couple has left. James sits alone on his porch, Duke's descendant, another cattle dog, sleeping at his feet. Stars fill the sky, brilliant and numberless. In the distance, barely visible in the moonlight, a lone rider sits on a ridge, watching over the ranch. The figure is too far away to identify, but James knows who it is. He raises his hand in greeting. The rider returns the gesture, then melts back into the shadows. James smiles and goes inside his house, the turquoise necklace glinting in the lamplight. James McKenna died in 1903 at the age of 76, peacefully in his sleep. At his funeral, attended by settlers and soldiers and townspeople from miles around, 2 elderly Apache women appeared, giants even in their old age, wrapped in blankets against the cold. No one knew how they'd heard about James's death. No one knew how they'd traveled from the reservation. But Nalin and Kasa stood at the grave of the man who'd saved their lives, and they sang an Apache prayer for the dead, their voices strong and clear. And as the first shovel of earth fell on James McKenna's coffin, both women placed something on his grave. Turquoise stones, the color of the Arizona sky, tokens of a debt that had been paid 1,000 times over but would never be forgotten. In a time of war, one man chose peace. In a time of hatred, one man chose kindness. And because of that choice, made in a single moment on a dusty morning in 1872, countless lives were changed forever. This is the true story of James McKenna, the rancher who fed 2 Apache sisters and earned the protection of 700 warriors. But more than that, it's a story about the power of simple human decency, a power greater than armies, stronger than hatred, and more enduring than the desert itself. While inspired by real events and the historical context of Apache settler relations in the 1870s Arizona Territory, this story is a dramatization. Chief Cochise was a real historical figure who did eventually make peace with the U.S. government. The Apache people were indeed forcibly removed to reservations, and their story is one of resilience, survival, and continued cultural strength. This narrative aims to honor that history while exploring themes of kindness, respect, and the possibility of peace even in the darkest times.